The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding
I should not be saying that.
We should be neutral, but...
Yeah. I will be leaving by 6. Order. Nick Fletcher to move the motion, please.
Yeah. I beg to move that this House considers e-petition 614335 relating to an international agreement on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Sharma, today. I first want to thank the petitioners for their campaign. The petition has received over 156,000 signatures and is therefore something that this House should rightly discuss. The petitioners ask that the government does commit to not signing any international treaty on pandemic prevention and preparedness established by the World Health Organization unless this is approved through a public referendum. The government, in their response to the petitioners back in May 22, stated, "To protect lives, the economy and future generations from future pandemics, the UK government supports a new legally binding instrument to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness and response." It finished its response with, "The process of ratification allows scrutiny by elected representatives of both the treaty and any appropriate domestic legislation in accordance with the UK's constitutional arrangement. The government does not consider a referendum is necessary, appropriate or in keeping with precedent for such an agreement." As I always do when leading petitions debate, I shall set out my role here today. I lead these debates not because I have specifically asked to do so or that I agree with the subject matter, but simply because it is my duty to take a number of debates each Parliament as a member of the Petitions Committee. I want that to be very clear. In this capacity, I cover a variety of subjects and, as all my committee colleagues will agree, I am superbly supported by the staff who assist the members of the Petitions Committee. I always believe the Petitions Committee typifies democracy at its best. I am therefore honoured to stand here and debate the views of a percentage of our nation's people on a specific subject. Today is no different. Let me begin today with some information on the World Health Organization. The WHO were established in 1948 and are the United Nations Agency on Health. Their headquarters are in Geneva. There are 194 member states grouped in 6 regions. Their website states that they lead global efforts to expand universal health coverage and coordinate response in a health emergency. One of its many success stories is the eradication of smallpox. It has worked in many areas across the globe in sexual and mental health. It has worked towards the eradication of polio. It helps across developing countries with the provision of clean water, help against the effects of climate change, earthquakes, the list goes on.
Can I thank you for giving way and highlighting both smallpox and polio? Isn't the fact of the matter that it's been a worldwide vaccination programme that has enabled us to achieve that? And doesn't that demonstrate the falseness of the anti-vax campaigns?
I thank the honourable member for his contribution, and I do believe that the World Health Organization should be proud of an awful lot of the work that they have done. More recently, the outbreak of COVID has brought many questions about the WHO, and that is why I would suggest one of the main reasons we are debating how the WHO can protect our population today. A question I believe should always be asked of any organisation is how is it funded? The WHO gets its funding from member states as assessed contributions. This makes up to 20%. But then 80% from voluntary contributions, again from member states that wish to give more, but also from the private sector and philanthropists. So what can the WHO do at present, and what does the treaty want to do? Well, through international health regulations, the WHO is alerted to potential events and can then give guidance to members. There is a legally binding agreement which directs nations on what they need to do in a public health crisis. International health regulations were crafted in 1969 and amended in 2005 and outline each member's responsibility. It is not really legally binding, though. From what I can understand, the WHO has no real power. Members can choose to ignore what the WHO says. It suggests rather than tells a country what it should do. It has no real enforcement powers, and all it can do is highlight those that don't follow guidance. But now the proposal is that through the proposed treaty, the WHO would be able to police its powers to motivate a country into doing what its officials believe is necessary. Some countries don't want this to happen, and the petitioners do not want the UK to agree with this without a referendum. Why, may you ask? Well, the petitioners believe that these sorts of powers should be sovereign. They do not like the fact that the WHO officials are unelected. They do not like the fact that some members pay in more money than others and could therefore have more influence on any decisions made. They also feel the same about philanthropists and pharmaceutical companies who make contributions too. Are they being over-concerned? In the treaty, there is a change of language from should to must. But are the WHO only doing their job to protect our population? There appears to be nothing about lockdowns, and I know that is one of the biggest concerns of the petitioners. The next question is, what would policing member states look like? It would probably mean sanctions, services or resources being withheld. But would that only affect the smaller countries? Would it really bother the superpowers? Would it really bother the members paying in the most money? Each question does tend to lead to another. It leads me to another part of the petition. Maybe a referendum is required. I genuinely don't believe in referenda. I was elected to stand here, educate myself on the various topics that come before this House and make decisions on my constituents' behalf. It is a position of privilege and does involve a lot of reading, but that is an important part of this position. Our constituents have their own jobs to do and therefore do not have time or maybe even the ease of access to the information we have in this place.
On that point.
Indeed.
But the honourable gentleman is quite right that he's elected by his constituency to speak on their behalf. But when it comes to the matter of sovereignty, surely that lies with the people. He is only, like I am, a custodian of that sovereignty for a brief period of time when it must be returned intact to the people who elected him so that they can elect someone else if necessary. And when it comes to giving sovereignty away, that has to go back to the people and that needs a referendum because the people will decide whether they wish to give their sovereignty away.
Thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention there, and I do actually come on to this right now. Is holding the referendum the right tool now? We had one in Scotland. It was widely accepted on all sides that it was to be a once in a generation. Those who lost have ever since pushed for another referendum. The same happened over Brexit. They consumed the nation. They are divisive. They polarise positions and leave a lasting legacy of division. So, is a referendum appropriate? Well, that's for the government to decide, but if they did, they must make all the facts known. But I would also suggest that petitioners, while playing their part in the education process, must do so also in a sensible manner. I have no time for conspiracy theories. There is a push for the WHO to gain policing powers over pandemic response, and our government needs to seriously look into this, as at least 156,000 people are concerned enough to have signed this petition. They are not alone in their concern. Some countries, I have already stated, have said they are not signing the treaty. Are they right? Whatever our politics may be, we should always be careful to hand over powers like this to an organisation that can be influenced by nations other than ours. Questions about whose agenda the WHO takes will be asked, and they should be prepared with some answers if they are to quell the concerns of many of the voices speaking on this subject. In summary, the WHO do some wonderful work. COVID has proved what devastation a pandemic can bring. There will be no doubt another at some point, and we do need that global perspective. We are a global community. Therefore, what happens here can soon have a bearing on a country across the globe. The question the petitioners are essentially asking is, should an unelected organisation have the powers to sanction countries like the UK if they do not wish to comply? That we have no real choice but to comply. Should the UK, without a referendum, sign up to this treaty? I look forward to hearing other members and the government's position. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Just a reminder that if members should bob if they want to speak. Thank you. I will come back later. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 614335 relating to an international agreement on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. John Spallon.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I was only intending to make a few interventions, but when there were very few people initially in the chamber, as I said to you, I was therefore wanting to make a brief contribution. See, firstly, part of this argument has been about vaccination. And we go back to Dr. Wakefield and that appalling piece of chicanery, which was the supposed impact of the MMR, for which has now been completely exposed, completely discredited, and indeed he is Mr. Wakefield and no longer a recognised doctor. But considerable damage was done, not just in the UK, but across the globe, with large numbers of parents worried about the MMR vaccine and then their children not having it. Suddenly, a disease that had been almost entirely eradicated decades ago, measles, starts to spread with very considerable impact on many children's health. We've already discussed how polio has been almost entirely eliminated, how smallpox appears, one must always be conditional on this, to be eliminated by vaccination. Yet, out of that poisonous cesspit of the right-wing conspiracy theorist ecosystem in the United States, and I'm a huge supporter of our alliance with the US, but within that there is an appalling subculture of those who live by conspiracy theories, and the anti-vaccine campaign is one of those, with detrimental impacts on health. And that obviously then fed into the COVID. We already have international bodies dealing with some issues. With the influenza vaccine, the International Committee, when this year's variation appears in the Southern Hemisphere, then gets to understand the basic structure and then informs the vaccine companies in the Northern Hemisphere, and we all produce that in order to fight that. Very occasionally, they get that wrong. Most of the time, they get it right, and that has a huge impact both on the health of individuals and on the impact onto the health service. That is about international scientific cooperation, and the COVID vaccine was an exact demonstration of how international cooperation had enabled us to produce a vaccine within something like 12 months instead of the normal 10 years. That is a great contribution to health and to stabilising and succeeding with the situation. With regard to referenda, there is an argument on major constitutional issues. For example, when it was proposed to change the voting system in this country, I think it was perfectly right to put that to the public, and the public very sensibly turned that down. And I don't think, by the way, that anybody should try and change the voting system without a referendum on that, on that issue. When there was an argument about, which could not be resolved here in Parliament, there was an argument about our relationship with the EU, then it was perfectly proper to have a referendum, and the people decided on that. What we can't be arguing is every issue, every policy, every treaty. We're signatories to hundreds of treaties around the world. Of course.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, but has he read the pandemic treaty proposed by the WHO, and has he also read the amendments to the international health regulations that have to be looked at alongside that very important document?
Yeah, you mean this is the request for this to be drawn up, not finalised yet, I don't think. This is a request to be drawn up by the previous Prime Minister, the member for Uxbridge. Is that what we're talking about? This is into fantasy land. The ability, as we saw, unfortunately, during the pandemic, the ability to get coherence across countries, even sometimes, unfortunately, even to move vaccines, is difficult. And there is the need to move at speed, because we absolutely saw the speed at which the pandemic, this was a COVID pandemic, it could equally have been an avian influenza pandemic. Indeed, there's a huge amount of similarities between, again.
I thank the honourable for giving way. He says they have to move at speed. Does he support the fact that Pfizer moved at the speed of science to the effect that they never even tested whether the vaccine was actually stopped transmission or contraction of the virus? And with this House mandated people to lose their jobs for not taking a vaccine which was unproven, unsafe, and was actually never going to stop them transmitting the virus.
It certainly wasn't unproven, certainly wasn't unsafe, and had a huge beneficial impact across the world. And unfortunately, we do have some, a very limited number, and we all get letters on this, of those who wallow in this realm of the conspiracy theories. And indeed, we've just had another example there. But the point I was making is, we sign trade treaties, we sign the World Trade Organization. That leads to certain forms of arbitration, which we are bound to. We've just signed a treaty with Australia as well. All of these put obligations. That's part of actually engaging with the world, unless we want to be North Korea and have a policy for hermits. And then we have reference to major pharmaceutical companies. I thought the pharmaceutical companies, and there are criticisms of them in some other areas, but I thought that the mobilisation of their intellectual power and their production capacity in producing a vaccine in record time to stem the tide of COVID was absolutely magnificent, along with the support, for example, one of the great villains of all these conspiracy theories being Bill Gates, and also the huge amount of work that his foundation has been doing in trying to eliminate tropical diseases, often little noticed, but making a huge impact onto so many millions and tens of millions of people, especially children, in Africa and in other areas. Therefore, what we're seeing is an overreaction, over hysteria, and I would argue, Mr. Sharma, that we should give it a firm rejection, as I'm sure it would do if it ever came to the floor of the House of Commons, and we should support international cooperation for international health.
Member to speak. 2 points. One is that the intervention should be brief. Secondly, those who are speaking, if they could refrain for intervention, let the other members to come, otherwise the timing might be an issue later on. Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. I'm very grateful to be called, and my thanks to my friend for introducing the debate and to all the petitioners who've brought this very important matter to the House. And I'm pleased to see so many colleagues present today. In fact, it suggests to me we should be debating this matter on the floor of the House, and I hope we will do in due course, as I will explain. I also want to give my thanks to the organisation Us For Them, who I've been working with on this and other matters, the campaign group who led the calls on behalf of children and young people during the lockdowns and are now very concerned about what this proposal might mean for the most vulnerable people in our society. Now, I acknowledge the impulse behind this treaty and the proposals that are before the World Health Alliance. I acknowledge that global threats that defy borders do require global cooperation. And it is certainly true to say that in this country we were not sufficiently prepared for the pandemic when it broke out. But I don't believe that the lack of readiness was a lack of international cooperation. Indeed, the degree of international cooperation was astonishing. I think the lack of readiness was in the ordinary business of contingency planning by the British state, the security of supply of equipment, the capacity in the health service, our ability to support the vulnerable and the isolating. That's where we weren't ready. In fact, you could say that in a crucial respect, the UK was prepared. We thought we knew what we would do in the event of a pandemic. We thought we would introduce targeted isolation, targeted protection of the most vulnerable, the application of personal responsibility, not mass lockdowns. That wasn't part of the plan. But we threw that plan aside immediately, and we went for exactly what everybody else around the world was doing. Almost everyone. Never forget plucky Sweden. I suggest that we had an excess of global collaboration during COVID-19 and not enough independence, and certainly not enough parliamentary scrutiny. And that's why I'm very concerned about this treaty and what lies beneath it. Because the treaty simply creates the infrastructure and the funding to implement the changes that are being planned anyway via amendments to the international health regulations. And it's these amendments that are of the greater concern. These proposed new regulations will hardwire into international law and into our own domestic policy a top-down approach to pandemics and to global public health. So yes, we need cooperation, yes, we need strategic vision, but no, we do not need ever more centralised solutions. And in fact, in this country, it wasn't the top-down approach that worked in COVID-19, from the centralised test and trace system to the food parcels for the isolating. What worked best was people taking responsibility for themselves and their neighbours, local government working with civil society, medical leaders exercising their judgment, public servants at the local level working flexibly and with initiative. What worked was not central control, but subsidiarity, decisions being taken as close as possible to the people that they affected. And now we see the World Health Organization setting itself up, not just as responsible... Happy to give way.
He's absolutely right in terms of testing, of tracing people and tracking and so on, where there was already an established infrastructure. But surely, in terms of vaccines, for example, that can only be done at a national and indeed international level.
Well, I'm all for international collaboration, including in the development of vaccines. But no, actually, I think that what we need is more independent development of medical devices and medical treatments. And in fact, it was a race between different countries that led to the vaccine programme. So, I mean, I think we have a very high degree of international collaboration at the medical level. I'm not sure we need more. So what we are seeing now, crucially, is the World Health Organization not just setting itself up as responsible for identifying pandemics, but also for the responses worldwide to those pandemics. These amendments recognise the WHO as the guiding and coordinating authority of international responses to public health emergencies of international concern. And of course, we know about the WHO, we know its unaccountable nature, the Director General appointed through an opaque, non-democratic process, too much power for international pharmaceutical companies. And these regulations propose the creation of a vast public health surveillance mechanism at public expense, but also, if the WHO itself was anything to go by, it would be substantially funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And crucially, as my friend from Don Valley just mentioned, it proposes that the existing powers for the WHO to make recommendations about what countries should do should be upgraded from non-binding to binding recommendations. So it amounts to a vast transfer of power to the WHO. And what would these new regulations enable? Legally binding obligations on countries to mandate financial contributions to fund pandemic response activities. It could require the surrender of intellectual property and technologies. It could mandate the manufacture and international sharing of vaccines. It could override national safety approval processes for vaccines, gene-based therapies, medical devices and diagnostics. How would you give way?
Thank you for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree with me that it was through the ability to react to COVID in a very agile way, which was only possible having exited the European Union at the time, that we were able to invest, procure and then roll out the vaccine that did in fact save millions of lives? And shouldn't this be a model, as he has in fact stated in his eminently sensible speech as usual, that this should be a model for moving forward?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and it's certainly the case, in my opinion, that the best aspects of the British government's response were the ones that we were able to undertake using our own sovereignty, and I agree with that. The powers for the WHO extend potentially to ordering border closures on countries, travel restrictions, tracing of contacts, refusal of entry, forced quarantining, medical examinations, including requirements for proof of vaccination, and even the forced medication of individuals. And it's not just when there is indeed a pandemic already declared that these powers might be invoked. It's when there is simply the potential for such an emergency that the WHO claims this power.
I am puzzled by this debate because I can't understand whether it is actually a debate about constitutional procedure in the House of Commons, which is whether we want more referenda. I would have thought we'd had enough of those. The UK is the second largest contributor to the WHO. This is a member-led process, so this is not an organisation that we are bit-part players in, where we're going to be directed and overrun. We cede sovereignty by membership of organisations. We cede sovereignty to go to war by being a member of NATO. This is a member-led process that, as I understand it, is to see that we're at the heart of preventing, better preparing for and designing how we respond to future disease outbreaks. It seems to me that is perfectly logical, and I'll make one offer as the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee in this House, that we would want to be very much at the heart of scrutinising any future treaty that we negotiated as a member state through the WHO, and then it would go through the processes of this House before any ratification took place. Isn't that the point of the House of Commons?
Hear, hear. Well, I'm very grateful, and that's a very important contribution and suggestion by my honourable friend, and I absolutely agree. I mean, he's not totally right about the way the WHO works, of course. a simple majority of member states would approve these new regulations and a two-thirds majority would approve the treaty. So even if we objected to it, it could still go ahead. We would then have the opportunity to opt out, which is what I suggest we do. But nevertheless, if we're talking about it, and indeed we absolutely should opt out, as I'll come to the point, I'm challenging these proposed regulations and this proposed treaty because they're wholly and fundamentally wrong and they represent an assault on our freedoms. But we absolutely should object. And I will give way in a moment, but I just think the honourable member's suggestion is absolutely right. Fundamentally, Parliament needs to exercise its own responsibility and its own duty to oversee what we're going to do here.
And isn't the easy answer to colleagues who like this thing that we will, of course, remain members of the WHO and read its advice and accept the advice where we wish. But why should we have to accept advice when they may get it wrong and we can do nothing about it because they decide, not us?
That's absolutely right. We have the opportunity to say no to this, and that is the opportunity we need to take. Because once we've said yes, we are then under this obligation, under these obligations to introduce all of these, potentially all of these terrible infringements of liberty. I'll make some progress and let other members come in. My final real concern about the proposals are that they set the WHO up as the single source of truth on pandemics and on responses to pandemics. And there's obviously a very legitimate and understandable need to challenge misinformation and disinformation. There is a real danger there, but surely members should recognise that there's an opposite danger too, when a single agency, a single supernatural national agency becomes the sole source of information on what is true. These are the people who said that COVID-19 definitely didn't come from a lab leak, rather than from the Wuhan Institute, as now seems likely. These are the people who said that lockdowns would only be short and temporary rather than lasting the best part of 2 years, who said that vaccines stopped transmission rather than having next to no impact on transmission. They said that the vaccines would only be for the vulnerable rather than for everyone, including little babies. They said they would be voluntary rather than mandated as they were in many countries, including very nearly our own. So I don't have confidence in the WHO and its satellites to be the single source of truth, either on the science or on the response. So I'll finish with observations on Parliament. As I just mentioned, the international health regulations, they're an existing legal instrument, so they just need a majority of member states at the World Health Alliance Assembly to come into force. We then have 6 months to opt out of them. A treaty would require two-thirds of member states. Now, I'm very concerned about the government's response to this petition. They said that the government, I quote, supports a new legally binding instrument, so they're in favour of something along these lines. And they also say that not every treaty requires implementing legislation and it is too early to say if that would apply here. So at the moment, we're not getting a commitment from the government that they would actually bring these proposals to Parliament. And I think that is very concerning. Now, Margaret Thatcher warned in a speech in Bruges in 1988 that the UK had not helped defeat the Soviet Union just to subject itself to a new supranational arrangement, the European Union, as it became. Well, we did subject ourselves to the EU until our own time. And I suggest we didn't leave the EU just to subject ourselves to a new supranational arrangement in the form of the WHO. Now, some may find that comparison ludicrous, as they find any defence of national sovereignty, except in the case of Scotland, ludicrous. They say that in our interconnected world, we need less sovereignty and more cooperation, which means more power for people who sit above the nation-states. I say that in the modern world, we need nation-states more than ever, because only nation-states can be accountable to the people, as the WHO is not. Only nation-states can temper their policy to the particular circumstances of the people, as the WHO cannot. Only nation-states have the legitimacy and the agility to adapt to the huge threats and opportunities of our times, as the WHO cannot. Now, I firmly believe this treaty and the regulations are another and a greater threat to parliamentary sovereignty, and it's not clear if government will submit the treaty and the regulations to parliamentary approval, but I very much believe that they should, and that should be the commitment that we get from the Minister today, I hope. Thank you.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. And I think today's debate is an incredibly important one. It does raise important issues about sovereignty, but I think it also delves into issues which are far broader than that which we've touched on already. And I'm under no illusions as to why this petition has received such a large number of signatures. It is because of what has been suggested could be in this treaty. But whilst researching for this debate, I did find a broad range of concerns, some of which I think are entirely reasonable, others of which are completely absurd. On the absurd side, there is a narrative that's been created that the World Health Organization is a body intent on world domination, borrowing tropes from conspiracy theories. I found one website referring to the WHO as globalists who drain our resources, serve our enemies and continue working to establish a global dictatorship over everyone and everything. I believe that sentiment is clearly ludicrous, as is the reference to the WHO being owned by Bill Gates or indeed the Chinese government. The reality, however, is far more mundane than the narrative spun. The first key point to remember, of course, is that nothing has yet been agreed. The treaty is being negotiated by, as we speak, amongst others, representatives of the United Kingdom. It really cannot be viewed as having something being imposed upon us when we are actually helping to develop. Indeed, it's also important to note that it was actually our Prime Minister at the time who was one of the signatories of the statement of intent to actually instigate these discussions. I certainly will.
It's on the record. As a former international health minister who has been responsible for the WHO within government and working with them, they are a supranational organisation, but they 100% are driven by their members. And we, as the second largest donor, and one of its founding members, are one of the most respected members around that table. So we are designing this process. We should be proud of that and at the heart of that, and then submit it to scrutiny by us doing our job. Does he not agree?
Yeah, I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee, who has got a great deal of experience in this area about why, actually, as a country, we are leaders in this field and why we should be proud of our role in creating WHO and fighting these pandemics that have happened over recent years. And I think it's also the case that, like all treaties, there is an opportunity for parliamentary intervention that's set out in the law, that's already established, and the government have committed, I think, in their response that any subsequent domestic regulations would need to be passed before this treaty is actually ratified. And of course, as we've already heard, we can, if we decide, opt out of it. So there is no question that this is something that is going to be done to us. We have the opportunity as a sovereign nation to say no to this. And I think, actually, given the amount of time that this House has spent debating questions of national sovereignty over the last 5 or 6 years, I think it would be counter to recent experience for us to be doing something that would actually give away sovereignty. And actually, there are important principles about parliamentary accountability that we need to bear in mind, because it would be, I think, unfair to actually allow some of the wild conspiracy theories to overshadow what I think are legitimate concerns about any potential impingement on our sovereignty and our democracy. And I think in terms of the specifics of the treaty, as I said already, the key to note is that actually it hasn't been finalised yet. But what we do know is there are broad parameters of negotiation set out in the latest zero draft of this, published in February. From what we can see from that, it says the guiding mission is, and I quote, to prevent pandemics, save lives, reduce disease burden and protect livelihoods through strengthening proactively the world's capacities for preventing, preparing for and responding to and recovery of health systems from pandemics. Now, I'd be very surprised if anyone objected to that as a set of guiding principles, but it is reasonable to ask what this definition means in practice. What is the procedure for declaring a pandemic, and what safeguards will be in place to ensure that individual liberties and rights are protected? And it is those questions and that ambiguity that has been seized upon by those who want to undermine global cooperation by stating fears that the treaty will restrict people's freedom of speech to the extent that dissenters could actually be imprisoned. It would impose instruments that impede on our daily life and also institute widespread global surveillance without warning and without the consent of world leaders. In other words, some of the hallmarks that we see from totalitarian governments combined with supercharged lockdown measures, of course, which are all already within the power of this government under the Public Health Act 1984. And indeed, these things under this treaty would apparently be done without our government having a say. If those claims had any basis in fact, then I think we would all be right to be concerned. But those claims are simply ones that do not stand up to scrutiny. Fact checkers have consistently stated that the WHO would have no capacity to force members to comply with public health measures. Indeed, a WHO spokesman is quoted as saying, as with all international instruments, any accord, even when agreed, will be determined by governments themselves who would take any action while considering their own national laws and regulations. So the very idea that we would allow our citizens to be imprisoned by a third party for expressing an opinion on something in this country is absurd. It is just not going to happen. We live in a liberal democracy, and I know that members across this House are determined to keep it that way. It is those nations that want to undermine Western democratic values, who want to create disarray, who are pushing this narrative that there is an unaccountable, unelected global group of people who are seeking to take control of our lives. So we can both protect our values of freedom and democracy and work more closely with other countries in the face of a global threat. Those two aims can be entirely consistent with one another. Creating a global treaty is an entirely reasonable and responsible course of action. One of the most important messages to emerge from COVID-19 was that we need to be better prepared for the next one. We have learned that global cooperation is crucial to success, whether that is coordinating measures to suppress transmission or conducting vaccine rollouts. It took the world far too long to understand that under the conditions of a pandemic, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. So to my mind, the question is much more about whether this Parliament and this government is up to the task of dealing with another public health emergency in a way that ensures democratic accountability and public confidence is maintained. As someone who spent many hours dealing with public health regulations during the COVID pandemic, I would say there is much to be done in terms of improving how Parliament has a role in that. And we know at times decisions had to be taken quickly, but far too often COVID regulations were debated weeks or even months after they were introduced. And as the pandemic progressed, it felt that there was no effort being made to have regulations debated before they came into force. And on numerous occasions, there was no objective reason as to why that needed to be the case. Indeed, sometimes the rules were only made publicly available on the government website minutes before they became law. So trying to obtain clarity about which measures, individually or collectively, were considered likely to lead to an increase or decrease in transmission rates was mission impossible. When we were able to see the minutes of SAGE meetings, which in the very early stages of the pandemic we were not, there was often very little correlation between them and the measures being debated. Sometimes there was no statement or explanatory memorandum that the measures being put forward in the regulations had even been considered by the scientific advisor. Often there was no SAGE minutes either that stated that these matters had been considered. Often what SAGE were recommending did not even make it into the regulations themselves. I'm sure many of us can remember the contradictions and confusions about some of the measures that were introduced. Why was an area in a particular tier, and the lack of clarity about how you moved in a tier and out of a tier, the decision to close pubs. I will.
I'm glad he agrees that we needed better parliamentary scrutiny and more options for the handling of the pandemic. But given that that is the case, how on earth does it make sense to give away powers to an international quango who would then instruct future ministers to do these things, and Parliament would be told it had no right to talk about it or to vote on it?
Well, if that's how it was going to proceed, then I would agree with him, but I don't believe that is the case. And I think anyone on that side who is concerned about parliamentary sovereignty and scrutiny would not have voted for the EU revocation bill, which has put thousands of laws into the hands of ministers without any parliamentary accountability. But returning to the question of how the last pandemic was dealt with, there were other examples of where decisions were made without seemingly any evidence to back them up. The decision to close pubs at 10 o'clock is a good example. The lack of any coherence about why people were only allowed to meet in groups of 6 and no more, why certain establishments could reopen and some could not. I know it was fast-moving and unprecedented situation, but given the draconian nature of the regulations, we really needed to be better than we were at parliamentary scrutiny. And given the release of the WhatsApp messages from the former Health Secretary, that's certainly given me food for thought that perhaps all the decisions were not made on a scientific basis. So I have to say, if we do find ourselves in another pandemic where measures are being proposed that affect people's daily lives, then the ability of this place to openly scrutinise and question government on decisions before they are made, as well as having access to the full scientific advice, will be vital. If decisions are taken transparently, and dare I say it, if everyone is seen to be following those rules, then we stand a much better chance of maintaining public confidence and that those measures are necessary. So I think that there's been a bit of talk about vaccine harms today. Mr Sharma, and I don't want to be seen as unfairly critical of those who've raised those concerns. I do understand that sometimes there is a deep desire for a rational explanation about the sudden loss of a loved one. I also believe you should be able to ask legitimate questions about vaccines. It is perfectly reasonable to debate who should receive a vaccine and how often they should receive it. It is also legitimate to scrutinise government decisions, particularly ones that impinge on individual liberty. But there is a world of difference between doing that and descending into the dark world of conspiracy theories, which suggests that vaccines do more harm than good. That risks pushing people away from potentially life-saving interventions, and over the long term, it risks damaging the public's perception of the importance of a tool that has been used to eradicate diseases that have frequently ruined lives. As we've heard, from smallpox to TB to polio, vaccines have saved millions of lives over the years. We cannot now abandon the importance of this work because of a few videos on YouTube. We need to be able to challenge and question, of course, but we should not ignore what decades of experience has shown us about the value of vaccinations. So in conclusion, Mr Sharma, this treaty has nothing to do with Bill Gates. This is not the first step in creating a world-dominating authoritarian state. I don't believe it will even impede on our sovereignty. What it will do, though, is enable the combined efforts of our brilliant researchers, medics and scientists to jointly tackle the increased threat that we face from pandemics. We achieve far more together as a species when we work together. I think the far bigger risk to our continued existence on this planet is not the so-called Great Reset, but a descent into paranoia and distrust, so that we avoid using our brightest and best, and they end up working in silos. They don't share their knowledge and efforts collectively. We want to avoid that. From pandemics to climate change to eradicating global poverty, we face many challenges as a species, some of which I believe are existential. But if we do not seek to work together to meet those challenges, then we will ultimately all be the worse off for it.
Thank you, Mr Sharma, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. In March 2021, a group of world leaders announced an initiative for a new treaty, a Convention on Pandemic Preparedness and Response. And this initiative was taken to the World Health Organization to be negotiated, drafted and debated by a newly established intergovernmental negotiation body. A petition resulting in this debate was signed by over 156,000 people, of which 441, just under 0.4% of my constituents signed, the third highest number from a constituency. Only Wells and Wealden constituencies have a higher number of residents who signed the petition. They want the government to commit to not signing any international treaty on pandemic prevention and preparedness established by the WHO unless this is approved through a public referendum. It is important that their concerns are listened to and answers provided. The idea behind the treaty is to ensure that there is a more joined-up approach to pandemics in future, and there's no question that the world will face other pandemics and health emergencies in the future. It's clear from COVID-19 that countries need to address these threats together. COVID-19 affected each and every one of us. No region or country has been spared. And according to the British Medical Journal, in less than 2 years, COVID-19 infected more than 240 million people, with 5 million lives lost. States agreed that the world must be better prepared to predict, prevent, detect, assess, and effectively respond to pandemics in a highly coordinated fashion. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a stark and painful reminder that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. This means that everyone across the world, no matter how poor or how challenging a nation state is, needs to have access to safe and affordable vaccines which are effective, and to medicines and diagnostics for future pandemics. So far, so good. But there is a claim that a legally binding WHO pandemic treaty will give the WHO the authority to trump sovereignty, in other words, to control UK policies during a pandemic, including those on lockdowns, school closures and vaccines. If true, This should be a valid concern for every country, and I would ask the Minister to provide reassurance to my constituents who signed this petition that it is firstly a voluntary treaty, secondly that it does not overrule the UK's ability to legislate for our own pandemic-related policies, and thirdly that no UK sovereignty would at any time be ceded to the WHO. There are also claims that the WHO has continued developing 2 international legal instruments intended to have force under international law with the aim of increasing its own global authority in managing health emergencies, including pandemics. It is claimed that these 2 instruments work in synergy, that the International Health Regulations, the IHR, amendments lay out new and specific powers and processes designed by the World Health Organization and its sponsors during health emergencies, and extending the context within which such powers can be used, and that the treaty provides the terms for the administration, financing and governance of the powers and processes underpinning the enlarged international health regulations. Whilst the government has so far expressed support for the treaty and has said it is actively shaping its design to ensure it improves how the world prevents, prepares for and responds to future disease outbreaks of pandemic potential, it is also made clear that the key will be to ensure the final text is clearly in the UK national interest. Negotiations on the draft text continue, including those on key international principles such as human rights, sovereignty, transparency, accountability, and so on. Can the Minister please confirm and provide assurance to my constituents who signed this petition that no UK government will sign any legal instrument, treaty or convention which will fundamentally and detrimentally change the relationship between the World Health Organization and its member states, including the UK? When a draft treaty is finalised, if indeed it is ever, as it needs the agreement of nearly 200 countries, it is vital that the why, when, how, what of the treaty and whether a treaty is actually needed are debated and considered and scrutinised by UK elected representatives. Does strengthening global health governance require a treaty? Are there more effective ways to strengthen global health governance after the COVID-19 disaster? These are questions which we must look at. What we must be wary of, however, are conspiracy theories distorting the facts and scaring people. Transparency of debate is therefore needed to squash these conspiracy theories, properly scrutinise and put people's minds at rest.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, and I welcome the opportunity to debate this topic. I've been calling for this debate for some months, and I thank the 156,000 electors who've voted for us to have this debate today. And the pandemic treaty must be viewed in coordination with the changes, the proposed amendments to the international health regulations. As George Santanea said, that those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them, and I do have some severe worries that the lessons of the last pandemic have not been learnt by the WHO themselves, and we are in danger of giving them more powers to enable them to overreach themselves and repeat those same catastrophic mistakes again. I would like to start by talking about the WHO itself. As my honourable friend for Don Valley pointed out, it was founded in 1948, a specialised agency of the United Nations responsible for international public health. It consists of 192 member states, basically the whole of the UN membership, excluding Liechtenstein and the Holy See. And it was based originally on a WHO constitution, which is still today, but this constitution will be fundamentally changed by the two instruments that are in the pipeline following the the COVID-19 pandemic. The WHO is domiciled in Geneva, and so it has special status. Its employees are exempt from tax, and they and their families all have diplomatic immunity. It is indeed a supranational body, unelected and unaccountable. I think my constituents would fear that. How is the WHO set up? Well, it has something called the World Health Assembly. It meets yearly in Geneva. It's a legislative and supreme decision-making body of the WHO. It elects the Secretary-General, the Executive Board, and votes on policy of the WHO. And the current chairperson of the World Health Assembly, the WHO, is a gentleman by the name of Harsh Vardhan. In 2021, Mr. Sharma, the Indian Medical Association, the Indian version of the BMJ, the largest association of doctors in India, issued a statement where he objected to Vardhan, who was endorsing Coronil, a product that was being made in India. The IMA, the Indian Medical Association, questioned the ethics of a health minister, Mr. Vardhan was the health minister at the time, of that country to release a fabricated and unscientific product onto the people of India. He's since gone on to become chairperson of the WHO, who are going to be presiding over this new treaty that's going to be sitting before every government in the world. Given that he resigned from the cabinet in India over this controversy, why has he ever been trusted with greater responsibility? It seems he's failed upwards, like many at the WHO and the WHA. So, the original ideals of the WHO were completely laudable. The WHO is to serve the health of the people. It's governed by its member states who will implement health policy in the interest of our people. State sovereignty and the rule of law will be respected. That's under Article 3 of the International Health Regulations, before they're amended. People's self-determination will be fully respected. All human rights, conventions and other acts will be respected that countries have joined up to. That was protected under Article 54 of the original regulations of human rights. But who's now funding the WHO? Like many of our regulators in the UK, the MHRA, 86% funded by industry sources. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, in their personal declarations, they declared over £1 billion of interests in Big Pharma, the thing they were set out to regulate. This undermines public confidence. Well, the WHO now is no longer anything like majority funded by its member states, the people who it is seeking to control. It's 86% funded by external sources. I'm not sure that my honourable friend for Winchester is correct. The UK is not the third largest donor. The second largest donor is the third largest donor. The second largest donor after Germany is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I think Gavi is the fifth. So you add those together, they are the biggest donors to the WHO. And you have to think, why are they doing this? They're also the biggest donors or biggest investors in pharmaceuticals and the experimental mRNA technology, which proved so profitable for those who proposed it and produced it during the last pandemic. Indeed, the WHO, it says the member states' contributions to WHO funds have been capped and today account for only 16% of WHO's total budget, with an increasing share of funding to WHO coming from voluntary contributions, where donors direct funding according to their priorities. Well, their priorities might not well be the priorities of my constituents in North West Leicestershire or the electorate in the UK, but he who pays the piper calls the tune. The WHO are promoting the influence of private-public partnerships. They promote that on their websites, to the point where it's pay-to-play. Anyone can buy influence at the WHO. It's just going to cost you money. And when it comes to when they're consulting, their own internal report, their survey evaluation, final report, May 23, 23rd of May 2022, the various interest groups have more input to the WHO policy than the member states. It said under the WHO's own figures that the member states' only participation was 40% of the input, whereas 60% came from non-member states and 276 stakeholders. So it's clear there's a strong external influence on the policy of the WHO, an entity which, if the amendments to the international health regulations and the pandemic treaty were to be passed, and doing nothing is not an option. If this House does nothing and does not vote, they will come to pass by May 24. So doing nothing is not an option. It isn't going to go away. So the WHO's intermediate study says the WHO is an international organisation created as a sub-agency of the United Nations for the objective of obtaining the highest possible level of health for all people. But at what cost? At what cost? What cost to democracy? What cost to individual freedoms? It is now 80% funded by non-member states, and it is heavily influenced. And it also, during the pandemic, it took extra powers called the fact that it could define information. It took on a position, and this will be enacted in law and binding in those two new instruments, that the WHO has the ability to say what is disinformation. And when anybody says to you that the science is settled on any issue, I suggest that this House would smell a rat straight away, because science is never settled. There is always open for modification, for new things to be discovered, theses to be refined, and what the WHO is saying is that the WHO will be the arbiter of what the science is, and that cannot be right. It's a bit like someone saying the market's changed. Well, in my experience, it never has. So that is a huge grab of power, and the two instruments, the pandemic treaty and the amendments to the international health regulations, are progressing in parallel. And for those who, I just really worry whether colleagues in this have actually read the treaty, because clearly, you know, when you take out the words "not binding" as an amendment, it then becomes binding. You know, these are binding treaties. If we do nothing, these treaties are binding. They're legally binding across all the nations. They're bringing in an idea called One Health. And this then extends the ability of the Director General of the WHO to call a public health emergency of international concern, which incidentally is abbreviated to FAKE. FAKE. So, and it says that he can bring it in on the suspicion, the risk of an international incident. It doesn't even have to be about a pathogen that's affecting humans. It can affect animals. He's taking the powers because it could be because of the environment or an increase in the levels of CO2. I suggest that honourable and right honourable members read the treaty. It's a massive extension of powers, and at the drop of a hat, one man, Mr. Tedros, can call for massive powers to the WHO, and not only will he call when he takes the powers, he will decide when the pandemic or the emergency is over, and when he'll possibly give us the powers back to this House, where elected representatives are supposed to be representing the interests of our constituents. Well, that will all be suspended. And I would, while we're talking about Mr. Tedros, I mean, I would just remind the House that this gentleman who will be deciding the fate of the world, it will be within his gift to call these emergencies. The conduct of the WHO in the recent Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 83 individuals who are working for the WHO sexually abused local women, and including the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl. And it was all covered up, Mr. Sharma. And in a leaked document from the WHO, which would have been in front of Mr. Tedros' committee, a confidential UN report submitted to the WHO last month concluded that the manager's handling of the case didn't violate WHO sexual exploitation policies because the woman concerned was not a beneficiary of WHO aid since she didn't receive any humanitarian support. That is completely unacceptable. If that's the rules of an organisation, they'll be deciding whether my constituents are locked down for 6 months, 3 months, and whether they can go and see their granny. I don't think it's acceptable. Also, these new treaties, they compress the time for governments of mandatory reporting lines of 72 hours from when a risk to public health has to be reported to the WHO, and he'll make a decision. This is far too little time for any research, any meaningful research to be done as to what the real risk is. And it will lead to lots of potential for false alarms and unnecessary disruption. These are huge powers that these two instruments would seek to take away from this Parliament and every other Parliament around the world. And they need to be considered very, very strongly. Sticking your head in the sand isn't going to do. It won't do for my constituents. You know, if we learn anything from the vote we had in 2016, is that people in this country, they do not want to be ruled by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. And there's no one more unaccountable and unelected of people in the WHO who don't pay tax, and they and their families have immunity from prosecution because they've got diplomatic immunity. They're also under the huge financial interests of whoever wishes to fund them. So many experts are now saying that these two instruments would fundamentally reset the relationship between citizens and sovereign states, not in this country, but also around the whole world. Unelected, unaccountable, top-down, supranational body, the WHO. What these treaties will do will empower that Director General to impose sweeping, legally binding, they are legally binding directions on member states. They'll be forced, they have the power then to force companies in this country or any other country to manufacture certain medical treatments and to export them to other countries and be told to do it. It'll have the power to shut down any business in this country, regardless of what the local people think or even this Parliament thinks. It takes away all the protections that being in a democracy offers. It actually takes away Article 3 in the original Constitution, which is the respect of human right and dignity. That goes and is replaced by a bland statement saying that there will be equity. And equity means whatever it means. It means that everyone's going to be treated equally. It also means that one solution to any international problem around the world. And that leads to an all-or-nothing situation, Mr. Sharma, where if the WHO got it right, and if we want to go in, if I have the time, I'll go into everything they got wrong in the last pandemic. If they get it right, okay, maybe okay. But if they get it wrong, that's the whole of humanity has got it wrong. There's no competition, and if there was only one car manufacturer, only one solution, I'm not sure it would be the best car that we could ever have. I think competition between nations for solutions is a good thing. I have grave concerns over these two instruments. And we have grave concerns. I have grave concerns to consider who's actually running and controlling the WHO organisation. It'd be foolish not to see that big pharmaceutical giants with their lobbying power, they have huge influence over the direction of the WHO. And like many multinational corporations, their size and scale supersedes even national governments. With over 80% of the WHO three-year budget now specified funding, and they have the ability to direct policy. I think it's fair to say we're drifting away from the WHO's original noble ethos of promoting democratic, holistic approach, cooperation to public health. The WHO let us down over COVID with their response. In January 2020, as already been pointed out, they were still telling us that there wasn't person-to-person transmission of the virus. That was wrong. That was wrong. And then they prescribed lockdowns and mass vaccination during a pandemic which drove mutations. The pandemic response by the WHO and the national governments should be a cautionary tale on the impact on citizens of handing power to the state, and should certainly not be a template for going further and faster in terms of signing away rights and liberties. Indeed, the pandemic response was so brutally illustrated. The profit-optimised version of the greater good pursued by the WHO often clashes with children's health. Before I spoke out on the 13th of December with regard to the risks of the experimental mRNA vaccines, the MHRA were looking to authorise the vaccination of children down to the age of 6 months in this country. I'm very grateful that the government listened, and we didn't do that. Indeed, it was then pushed back to people over 50, and after my speech on the 17th of March, I'm delighted that the government now has put it back to only those over 75. That's in a few months, that's a huge difference from we're going to vaccinate everybody, and I think that tells the tale of, if we were all under one rule, we'd be doing exactly the opposite of what this country has individually decided to do. So while we're on the subject of opaque, undemocratic organisations, it's interesting to see what the EU are doing. Well, the EU are actually going to, they think that we need to strengthen all this, and they're going to set up, not only with will the WHO be allowed to have a department of misinformation, they'll be the arbiters of whatever the truth is during an emergency. The EU are going to take over exactly the same policy, and they're going to have their own as well. So when we have a pandemic situation, there will be only one version of the truth. Well, that's not very good for science, is it? The One Health approach, it's also a whole society approach. They will have the ability to mobilise every aspect of our society. Once they call those emergencies, they're going to be able to keep them going. They have control of absolutely every aspect of our citizens' life. This is absolutely massive. There's no more important treaty. Of course, if we were to give these sort of powers, which I would never vote for myself, of course we should have a referendum, because sovereignty belongs to the people. It's not ours to give away, and we know that from the referendum we had in 2016. I hope the House listens very carefully and reads these documents.
Ashton McGrath.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mr. Sharma. I'm also grateful for my honourable friend, the honourable member for Don Valley, for moving this motion. And I'd like to thank the 156,000 people who signed this petition, including 295 of my Tatton constituents, which helped secure this important debate today. Now, the vast majority of the nation has been busily moving on from the pandemic and the lockdowns, and rightly so. But much analysis of COVID and of those lockdowns is still ongoing, with the UK COVID inquiry beginning to hear evidence in June for its first investigation. And as co-chair of the APPG on pandemic response and recovery, I welcome that inquiry, as I do all other frank, open discussions and analysis on the impact and the effects of lockdown, and also how policies were originated and formulated. Our APPG has heard from renowned experts such as Professor Carl Hennigan, Lucy Easthope, Mark Woolhouse, Robert Dingwall, Dr. Alison Pollock, Lord Jonathan Sumption, Kate Nichols-Obier, and many more, who have all advocated for evidence-based, proportional measures to prevent avoidable suffering and loss. However, whilst all this analysis is still ongoing, the World Health Organization is preparing an international treaty on pandemic prevention and preparedness. And it's this treaty that seeks to enhance international cooperation, which sounds good in theory, but critics say in practice it could transfer power away from sovereign and democratically elected nations and the rights of the individual into the hands of the WHO, an unelected and largely private-funded bureaucracy. And that is the nub of it. Who is having the oversight? Who is creating these powers? Who's going to have a say of it? And that is why people have written to their members of parliament to have a debate here today. They're saying, where are those powers going? Who is to remain sovereign? Who is going to have oversight? And so today, while we're here, it's to allay those concerns. It's to get those issues out in the open, and it's to head off any issues and to ensure that we are not signing away our sovereignty. And here's just a couple of the issues that constituents of mine have flagged up for the Minister to address. It is those word changes. It is not that countries would have to consider, it's now they will follow. It's not that it is non-binding, it is now that these things are binding. My constituents aren't some kind of conspiracy theorists. They come to me saying, you are my member of parliament, I want to hear you debate things on the floor of the House. I want you to be accountable, and if you're not, we'll vote you out at the next election. But we want to know that we are in control of what's going on, and that is why we're here today. They are concerned with those word changes, and what we're doing, I will indeed give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and she's making a great and informed speech. Is she aware, and is the Chamber aware, that the WHO have extended the public health emergency of international concern every 6 months since January 2020? And regarding to the as far as the WHO are concerned, we're still in an emergency, and they will decide when that emergency is over, and they would return these powers to us once these treaties are in place.
I want to thank my honourable friend for putting that down and saying those words on the floor of the House today so they can be documented in Hansard. And these are other concerns that my constituents have. They remind me, not that I needed to be reminded, that it was the WHO that went against their own 2019 evidence-based pandemic influenza guidelines. It never advocated lockdowns as a method of controlling respiratory illnesses, but following China's early lead, it began to champion lockdowns. Just look at the U-turns on face coverings. In March 2020, they did not recommend them for healthy people, but the sudden change in their guidance that followed happened despite the apparent lack of any new high-quality research. It was BBC's Newsnight that suggested in July 2020 that the decision was as a direct result of political lobbying. Prior to COVID-19, the WHO had repeatedly overestimated deaths from new infection diseases and outbreaks. For example, in 2009, they predicted a swine flu death toll of 7.5 million and warned that nearly a third of the entire world population would become infected. This led to knee-jerk overinvestment in vaccine contracts, which clawed precious money away from fighting other diseases. In the end, it was concluded that the total global mortality was roughly on a par with annual deaths caused by seasonal influenza, nowhere near the original prediction. It is these issues, or it is those issues, that my constituents are raising with me. Just issues about who is it then we're handing over to control to. So they say, you know, WHO has not covered itself in glory on providing consistent, clear and scientific sound advice for managing many international disease outbreaks. And as we've heard from many people today, the World Health Organization was set up in the aftermath of World War II with the aim of providing a high standard of healthcare for all. They approached health in the round, promoting community-based services to address physical, mental and social well-being, all admirable reasons for why it's set up. However, in recent decades, their focus appears to have narrowed as private foundations and pharmaceutical companies become an increasingly significant and influential part of the WHO's funding base, and their approach has become more focused on vaccine-based interventions and, most recently, focused on blunt instruments like lockdowns, which, as I've said, we're still analysing the consequences of those. Safe to say, there was a negative impact on the young. As Ofsted's 2021 damning report pointed out, children had fallen well behind in their education and suffered significantly, particularly in mental health, as a result of that. And here in the UK, it's estimated that school closures will lead to significantly lower life expectancy and £40,000 being lost from their lifetime earnings for each individual. Children should never have had to shoulder such an enormous burden, one that will likely hamper them for the rest of their lives. And these lockdowns, these stay-at-home mandates, damaged the economy, but more importantly, it drove many people, and will do, into poverty, to such an extent that Professor Thomas of Bristol University thinks that 2.5 million life years have been lost because of a loss of GDP and because of those lockdowns. That is incredible, what we have put upon people, the poverty that we have inflicted on people with lockdowns. So this petition, calling for a referendum on the treaty, makes it clear there is growing concern about the expansion of powers of the WHO and the encroachment on national sovereignty. The UK government has declared unilaterally that the UK supports a new international legally binding instrument as part of a cooperative and comprehensive approach to pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. So can the Minister explain to me how this can be the case when Parliament has not yet been allowed to scrutinise those plans? While we must not overhype, I get that, the nature of the threat this proposed treaty should give us, or could give us, it must, however, make us all pause for thought. It may not yet be clear how the WHO would legally enforce any of these emergency powers and policies, but there is plenty of potential for their unelected bureaucrats to chip away at our democratic standards. It is vital, therefore, that we must demand robust debate and have an open review of all of these plans in Parliament and in public, something that was sorely lacking during COVID times. Our parliamentary system wasn't really designed to support referendums, so I would be loath to inflict another referendum on the public. However, I agree that it does need parliamentary scrutiny. We need debates, we need votes in both houses to ensure this country lives up to its democratic obligations to its citizens and to ensure we continue making our own decisions about how we manage public health threats in this country.
Secretary Chops.
Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure to follow my right honourable friend who does such important work on her APPG. And at a recent meeting, we were privileged to be able to listen to Toby Green and Thomas Fuzzy, the joint authors of the COVID consensus. And I know that some of the material which she's used in her remarks is also comes from the fantastic work that those two individuals have put forward. I'd like to start off with the question, why is our government supporting changes to the treaty based on Article 19? Because Article 19 is the compulsion, mandatory, whereas Article 21 is the opportunity to opt in and out. So why would we wish to impose a commitment which we cannot get out of under Article 21? And I'd like, under Article 19, I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, when she responds to this debate, to embrace the idea which has already been discussed in the intergovernmental negotiating body, that while Article 19 is the most comprehensive provision of the WHO Constitution under which the instrument could be adopted, it's open to confirming whether Article 21 could also be appropriate as a way of making progress on the treaty. Because Article 21 relates to the WHO Assembly's powers to adopt regulations on a range of technical health-related matters. Regulations under Article 21 would come into force for all member states, except where members reject or make reservations within a specified notice period. In other words, it would be much more relaxed, or relatively speaking, more relaxed than Article 19, which would effectively mean that this was a mandatory treaty to which we would have no option but to with which to comply. And if we think that the only way to deal with pandemics is to for all countries to unite together across the globe, let's remind ourselves that actually, if we had our time again, many of us would have said that the Swedes got it right. They were, in a sense at the time, the outliers. Under some international mandatory ruling, they wouldn't have been allowed to experiment in the way that they did, follow their instincts for liberty and freedom and science-based evidence before restricting people from being able to go about their normal business. So why would we want to have a treaty which gave no flexibility to individual countries to decide what was best for in their particular circumstances in any given situation. So I hope that we can get an answer from the government on that and why they are going hell for leather to try and adopt a mandatory treaty. The extent of concern about this issue, I think, has taken many people by surprise. And that's, I think, symptomatic of the loss of trust that the people have now got in governments, and in particular some of the health departments of governments. And my right honourable friend mentioned in passing that the WHO itself did a complete vote-fuss, because they were supposedly experts and they brought forward a document relating to preparedness for a pandemic in November 2019, and that document made no reference whatsoever to many of the measures that were subsequently adopted by the WHO and by other governments across the world. My right honourable friend referred to there was no mention of even the word lockdown, let alone the idea that by confining people to barracks and preventing them going about their daily lives was actually going to be good for health outcomes. And we know now that it's been pretty bad news indeed for people, particularly the younger generation, because they were under less threat from COVID-19 to their own direct health. But as a result of the lockdown measures, they have, I think, suffered disproportionately and will continue to suffer as they live the rest of their lives. So why should we want to trust the WHO? Absolutely. Yeah, of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's a stalwart for those who've been vaccine harmed and vaccine bereaved, and he's making a great contribution. Does he agree with me that the WHO has let us all down very badly by its unilateral decision not to investigate where this virus originated? Because if we could find the labs that it was developed in, find out those who authorised it and funded it, and bring them criminally to account, surely that would be the best way of dissuading anyone from carrying out this sort of actions again, which has perpetrated so much harm around the world.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, a question which I was going to, in a sense, pose and seek to answer. Because I think one of the issues is, well, obviously China has a lot to cover up. And if it isn't covering it up, why is it not allowing people to investigate exactly what happened at Wuhan? Why isn't it cooperating with the World Health Organization? And I think the answer to that question is that, in a sense, the World Health Organization is now subservient to China. And for those of us in this House who have long expressed concerns about undue Chinese influence over our lives and over the freedom of Western civilization, I think we need to really take stock and ask ourselves who is in charge of this World Health Organization. And some people have referred to him by what I think is one of his Christian names, Tedros Adhanom, but I'm going to refer to him by his surname, which is Ghebreyesus. He is a former Ethiopian Minister of Health. He previously was a senior figure in the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And some people here today may remember that many senior members of the Tigray People's Liberation Front were also members of the Marxist-Leninist League of Tigray. Mr. Ghebreyesus won support from Beijing in order to become the Director General of the WHO. And the WHO has got quite a large control through him, which is being controlled by China. A former WHO Director General Margaret Chan, said in 2012 that the WHO budget is driven by donor interests. And let's be quite open about it. The Bill Gates Foundation and Big Pharma, Big Tech, they are supplying a lot of the resource to the WHO. And they're not covering it up. They're proud of it. Indeed, they make a big thing of the fact that now the WHO, more than half its expenditure is actually on vaccine programs rather than other ways of alleviating malnutrition and health problems across the globe. So this man, the current Director General, has he got connections with the Gates Foundation and the big funders of the WHO? Yes, he has. He was formerly a member of two of the Gates boards, Gavi and the Global Fund. So he himself is very much in with Gates, with the donors. And so how can he be trusted to be independent when he owes his position and continuing position to those donors and also to the support of the Chinese Republic? So we may say, well, so what? So what? Let the WHO carry on as it has been carrying on for many, many years. It can be an advisory body. It doesn't have to, nobody has to listen to it, and we can take it or leave it. But unfortunately, the developing influence of the WHO is that they now wish to impose their standards on the whole world. And that's why people have become alerted to this, and they signed this petition in very large numbers because they don't wish this country to give up control over its ability to be able to manage its own affairs when faced with an epidemic or a pandemic. And they certainly don't want somebody like the WHO, which is wedded to the Chinese version of authoritarian capitalism. They don't really want authoritarian capitalists telling people what they can't do and what they can do and saying you can't go out and go about your normal business, you can't live your life as an individual, you can't as an old person meet your relatives and all the rest. All those restrictions on freedom, and I'm pleased to say that insofar as we were able to, I voted against all of them and continue to believe that we made big mistakes in the way in which we addressed the pandemic through lockdowns which were not scientifically based and in respect of which there were no proper cost-benefit analyses. But leave that on one side. We've got the WHO. It is controlled by people we would not wish to be in control of our lives. And indeed, that's why both the United States and our government are trying to break out of some of the controlling influences that the Chinese government has got. And so what are we doing about it? Why, in these circumstances, would a rational government, because I still believe that the government I support is rational, why would a rational government actually engage in giving an enormous amount of power to the Chinese and to Chinese-influenced and dominated organisations over our lives? Just seems to me it's sheer lunacy. I hope my right honourable friend in responding to this debate will be able to agree on that point. One doesn't have to do more than just point out the connections between the Director General, the Bill Gates Foundation, the Chinese government, and so on, to normally expect people to say, gosh, I'm a bit concerned about that. In our daily lives, we judge companies and organisations on the basis of looking at the people who are running those organisations. And if one looks at the people who are running the WHO, I think we quite rightly should be raising some very, very serious questions about their behaviour. There's a lot more that could be said about this, treaty, but I'm going to finish my remarks by just saying, please, can the government change its approach to this? Listen to the people. And this is a very large petition signed. You know, it's not the sort of petition that you can present to somebody and say, well, you'll sign that. In order to actually sign this petition and apply your mind to it, you would have had to have actually had a pretty good understanding of the subject matter. So in that respect, although it's got several now well above the minimum threshold for a debate in this House, I think the quality of the petition, the arguments that it contains and so on, I think that means that it's actually one of the most serious petitions that we've had to debate in this chamber. Because... Yeah, of course I will.
Without wishing to be accused of being a conspiracy theorist, could I just spin a scenario to him? A nightmare scenario where the House ignored these new two instruments by the WHO, and sometime in the next 12 months, before they're ratified in May 24, there happened to be another release from a lab, another pandemic, and then both houses of this House were given no time to debate in an emergency situation to ratify these two instruments without debate. Is that not a nightmare situation? We should avoid that by having the debate now?
Well, I agree with my honourable friends. I almost always do. And in order to... Prevention is better than cure. And why would we want to give up control over all these issues by signing up to this treaty? And I've got here a quote from Richard Horton, who is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet. And he said, the allegation that the WHO shares responsibility for the pandemic by a policy of appeasement towards China has proved impossible to refute. So there you've got it. The editor-in-chief of The Lancet, no less, is saying we need to be extremely suspicious of what's going on, what may happen in the future. If that isn't a good credential for the government to adopt in saying, no, we're not going to adopt this WHO treaty under Article 19, we're going to examine it more carefully and be much more circumspect and retain the ability of our own country and our own people to decide these important issues for ourselves.
Backbenchers wanting to speak have done so. We're moving now on to the front bench spokespeople, and I call Anne McLaughlin for the SNP.
Thank you very much, Ms McDonough. There is a need for scrutiny and reflection of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we do need to understand and plan for any future pandemics. But there needs to be an international plan and approach, and the SNP fully supports this WHO agreement. The SNP has supported global cooperation and coordination throughout the coronavirus pandemic, because it's only when the world is safe from COVID-19 that any of us are truly safe. Only by working together and embracing global cooperation, not competition, cooperation, can we tackle global crises such as climate change and pandemics. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the importance of strong global public health infrastructure and how quickly healthcare provision can break down if the basics of medicines, tracking, treatment and other resources are not available. As others have said, international collaboration is the best way to avert and handle future pandemics. And the world, again, is not safe until all populations are safeguarded, wherever they are in the world. I understand the principle behind the petition, and I appreciate that people want to be able to hold their government to account, and we must be able to scrutinise governments. But there appears to be some misunderstanding about the work of WHO and how it interacts with governments. I've listened to and I've done a bit of reading on the reasons given by those who oppose this potential treaty, and they often have concerns that the WHO will be running health policy for all countries who sign up to the treaty. But those working on drafting the treaty have already included sovereignty as one of its guiding principles and rights. In the latest draft of the treaty from the 1st of February of this year, it starts by, quote, reaffirming the principle of sovereignty of states parties in addressing public health matters, notably pandemic prevention, preparedness, response and health systems recovery. There are no proposals to change this, and the healthcare policy, even in a pandemic, will remain entirely a matter for sovereign nations to decide. The World Health Organization can make recommendations once the global emergency is declared, but they are just recommendations. Contrary to what others have said, they are non-binding. The treaty will not require governments to act on WHO instructions, nor will it require anyone to sacrifice sovereignty. Rather, it will enable governments to plan together, detect pathogens more quickly, share data more broadly, and respond more effectively to the next pandemic. And those concerned with the impact of the WHO's involvement are perhaps unaware or have forgotten that the UK already implements WHO's International Health Regulation, or IHR. These regulations provide a framework that defines countries' rights and obligations in handling public health events and emergencies that have the potential to cross borders. These regulations have been in place in some form since 1969, and the latest regulations have been in operation since 2007. This has not meant a loss of control over health policy by individual nations. On the international stage, Ms McDonough, the SNP will always support measures to improve global public health. These include reversing the damaging aid cuts by the UK government, specifically in this context, those inflicted upon health and well-being projects. No, I don't think I will, no, sorry. As part of the wider cuts to official development assistance from 0.7% to 0.5% of gross national income, creating a £4.6 billion funding black hole compared with 2019 levels, health and wellbeing programme funding has been absolutely slashed. And as part of their wider international development pattern, the UK government is cutting funding for conflict resolution projects at a time of renewed war, cutting health and medical funding during and in the aftermath of a global pandemic, and cutting food programmes during a time of global food insecurity. All of this is morally reprehensible. It is positive, of course, that the UK government is supporting the treaty, but it's important to remember that despite the pressing need for a global collective response to health crises, the UK government is repeatedly falling short of the mark, as I've just said, and reneging on its pledges. It's morally, in my view, morally and pragmatically indefensible that the UK government continues to actively jeopardise the lives and well-being of the world's poorest and most vulnerable by maintaining the ODA budget below 0.7%. There's no other way to describe what the government is doing. So, along with supporting this treaty, the SNP is calling on the UK government to reinstate the aid budget to 0.7% of GNI as an urgent priority, ensure that aid spending on health programmes and projects around the world is increased to pre-COVID-19 pandemic and pre-UK aid cut levels, and ring-fence the overseas aid budget for spending abroad, ensuring that the aid budget is not being spent here in the UK on refugee and asylum support. And on that, they must also establish a much improved standalone Home Office model which better supports refugees and asylum seekers. The SNP believes that referenda are essential to establish public consent on issues concerning constitutional make-up and sovereignty, not on every issue someone might disagree with. This treaty will have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the UK's constitutional function and sovereignty, and therefore we are of the firm belief that this treaty does not warrant a referendum. I was almost persuaded, I was certainly sympathetic when the Honourable Member for Devizes lamented the terrible situation where the UK might be unable to make its own decisions if they are outvoted by other countries. Imagine. But, as the Honourable Member for Winchester said, the UK is a leading member of the WHO, primary architects of the treaty. So that's not what's happening here. If it was, however, what level of hypocrisy does it take to think that this one issue deserves a referendum, but the unresolved issue of Scotland's independence does not? The final outcome for consideration on this prospective treaty is expected to be presented to the 77th World Health Assembly in May 2024. Scotland stands ready to play our part in international efforts to collaborate and cooperate, not compete, on pandemic preparedness, awareness responses and collective prevention. So we do not support this petition.
Spokesperson Preet Gill.
Ms McDonough, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship on this debate responding to the e-petition 614335 on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. I want to thank the honourable members from across all sides of the House for their contributions this afternoon, and I'm glad this debate has been conducted in a mostly measured and thoughtful way. The COVID pandemic has been one of the most surreal and seismic global events of our lifetimes. 212,000 people have died as a result in the United Kingdom, and our economy has been directly hit to the tune of 250 billion of lost GVA. And the social impacts on everything from our children's lost learning to NHS waiting lists will be felt for many years to come. The extent of the damage the pandemic caused was not inevitable. The UK was badly unprepared. NHS waiting lists were at record levels even before the pandemic hit, and we had 100,000 staff shortages in our health service, 112,000 vacancies in social care. In 2016, the outcome of exercise sickness informed the government that the NHS would not be able to cope with a flu pandemic, and yet they still reduced the stock of PPE and the number of beds. Too many people have paid for that decision with their lives, particularly in care homes across our country, as untested patients were ferried from hospitals to homes. And then, of course, the billions of public money that has been wasted on unusable PPE, their chaotic shuffling in and out of lockdowns from a government that couldn't get a grip. And at the end of it, the UK's abject position as the worst hit economy in the G7. After 12 years of Tory complacency, the next Labour government will never leave our country with such a soft underbelly. The next Labour government will deliver a new 10-year plan for the NHS, including one of the biggest expansions of the NHS workforce in history, doubling the number of medical school places to 15,000 a year, training more GPs, more nurses, more health visitors each year, and harnessing life sciences and technology to reduce preventable illness. While it might feel like the pandemic is over here now, the threat is not, and that is what today's debate is about. Far from a once-in-a-hundred-years event, many natural biological threats have emerged in recent years, including SARS, avian flu, MERS, Ebola and monkeypox. Climate change and globalisation mean that natural biological threats are becoming much more common. And it is not only biological threats that we must prepare for. Advances in gene editing mean virologists can more easily modify viruses to be more deadlier and spread more quickly, increasing the security risk posed by bioweapons and bioterrorism. On this, I wonder if the Minister might comment on our concern that the Biological Weapons Convention currently remains very weak, with little funding and only 4 staff compared to the 500 staff of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Ms McDonough, pandemic preparedness must therefore be taken seriously as a matter of national security. Future threats could be far deadlier than COVID-19. During the first wave of coronavirus, 1% of infected individuals died, compared to 80% during the West African Ebola epidemic. The lesson of the pandemic was that no one is safe until everyone is safe, that global health is local health. So it is clear that global cooperation on pandemic preparedness and biological threats needs to be strengthened. It is why on this side of the House we absolutely support the principle of a legally binding WHO treaty which sets the standard for all countries to contribute to global health security. Our country was set back not just once, but 3 times by new dangerous COVID variants which had originated overseas. We are stronger together than trying to firefight these crises alone. The WHO is the primary UN agency for international public health, and in its history of over 70 years, it has contributed to the eradication of smallpox. It has helped immunise millions of children against preventable diseases such as tuberculosis, measles, and it is, of course, it's supporting the near eradication of wild polio. Currently, the WHO is responding to 55 graded emergencies around the world. Last year, it supported member states in response to over 75 different health emergencies, and over 339 million people are now in need of direct humanitarian assistance. And within those countries affected by fragility and conflict, we're seeing 80% of the world's major epidemics. The principles laid out in the zero text of the pandemic preparedness is a strong foundation from which to begin to tackle some of these crises. Its text on strengthening global health systems and universal health coverage, on international transparency and the sharing of technology, of diagnostics, vaccines and know-how, echo what we have said consistently on this side of the House during the pandemic. It is through multilateral efforts, strengthened through international law, that we can ensure that the response to the next pandemic is faster, it's more effective, and it doesn't leave other countries behind. Now, I know that the member for North West Leicestershire has been calling for this debate for some time and has reservations about this. I think it's really important that we do have this debate and show that there is no shadowy conspiracy here. I am afraid it is much more mundane than that. I note his claims that a treaty will, and I quote him, hand over powers to an unelected supranational body, even despite the fact that it would still have to be ratified by the United Kingdom, and there is over a year of negotiations to go. I would point out to him the very first statement in the zero draft text, which reaffirms, and I quote, the principle of sovereignty of states parties. Moreover, that the implementations of the regulations, I quote, shall be with the full respect for the dignity, for the human rights and the fundamental freedoms of persons. There are, of course, no references to vaccine mandates or lockdowns or any such draconian policies in the draft text. If he reads it, the draft treaty is primarily about transparency, fostering international cooperation and strengthening global health systems. So in recognition of the catastrophic impact of the pandemic on developing countries, it is therefore on the face of the text. So there are going to be negotiations. I will give way.
Has she taken the point that there's a difference between Article 21 and Article 19? Why is she supporting Article 19 as a means of introducing this measure rather than the more flexible Article 21?
I've already set out, I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, but I have set out the reasons that I am supporting this, and I'm going to further make those, that case a little bit further, and he will understand why we are supporting, on this side of the House, the treaty as it stands. And of course, there is negotiation, and I keep saying this, we've got to ratify this in the United Kingdom. There is another year to go to be able to contribute and feed into this. So I think, you know, his comments really need to be directed at the Minister. And as I said, the negotiations operating on the principle that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and that's a really important principle to hold on to. So in over a year's time, there's going to be 2/3 vote of WHO members, and then ultimately it's going to be for us to ratify and enact those policies as we interpret them. And I think this is really important that we recognise this. I would say that far from being a conspiracy, this process is actually the very basis for international cooperation, which is essential to tackling transnational threats. And as a country, we have a proud history of supporting the international system, using our influence and our expertise to set some of those common standards and bring parties together to achieve more than what they can do alone. So if we can use the World Health Organization to support basic universal health care around the world, then infectious diseases are less likely to spread and fuel global pandemics. Of course, that is in our national interest too. Ms McDonough, as I have said, pandemic preparedness is a matter of national security. Last year, in a debate on global vaccine access, I warned that striving for vaccine equity, it wasn't only a moral imperative, but a matter of national interest. Yet those lessons have not yet translated into action. Today, just 27% of people in low-income countries have received a first dose of a COVID vaccine, demonstrating the terrible divide in coverage between richer countries and the global south. This government has paid homage to the need to address this in words and announcements, but in truth, their record has been dire. A damaging departmental merger between DFID and the FCO at the height of a global crisis, repeated aid cuts to the very programmes designed to keep us and others safe, promise to poorer countries made and then consistently not kept, and nobody expected the UK to retreat from the world stage at a time like that, to vandalise its own relationships, expertise and capacity. But the message it sent out to our partners and allies has been received loud and clear. They know who they can trust to show up in an international crisis and who they cannot. The irony is that those decisions harmed us as much as anyone. Vital research programmes to track new COVID variants were slashed by 70%, pulling the plug on many programmes mid-project, causing years of research to go to waste. Programmes to treat tropical diseases were cut by a shocking 95%, leaving millions of people vulnerable to these diseases and risking the wastage of over 270 million doses of life-saving drugs. The UK's contribution to the global polio eradication initiative was cut by 95% for at least 5 years. Then last summer, polio resurfaced in the United Kingdom for the first time in 40 years. Now, as our government diverts the development budget to prop up its failing asylum system, 8 of South Sudan's 10 state-run hospitals has lost their funding this month, putting them on the brink of collapse. So can the Minister explain what assessment she has made of the impact of that decision? Can she say when the refreshed global health framework will be published and how it will draw lessons from the last 3 years? The divide exposed by the pandemic was stark at a time when millions in the global south were in greatest need. The international system failed them. The government's charity model of aid did not share vaccines equitably or effectively, leaving millions unprotected and the poorest countries paying the highest price. And the UK's own promises illustrate the point. At the G7 in 2021, the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, promised to donate 100 million surplus vaccine doses within a year. A year later, barely a third were delivered. The aid budget was raided to do it, and the UK effectively profiteered at poor countries' expense. Earlier this month, provisional spending figures for 2022 were revealed, and a further 225 million was charged against the aid budget for vaccines that we had spare, making a total effective £330 million cut. I wonder if the Minister could provide a breakdown of the number of doses that were shared directly with developing countries and those that went through COVAX by make and pricing last year. How many of those doses were shared in total, and what steps did she take to minimise the cost to the aid budget, bearing in mind that these surplus doses would have been incinerated if they weren't used, and how many vaccines were priced at the maximum possible of $6.66. Ms McDonough, there is a different way, one which does not merely give people our crumbs from the table. Labour's new model for development will be based not on charity, but on solidarity and on long-term development planning. Our comprehensive plan to ramp up global vaccine manufacturing set out in 2021 is the blueprint for the change that we need to see. The pandemic revealed a fundamental problem, namely that the world has more capability to invent and develop vaccines than it has to manufacture and distribute them on a global scale. So while donating our surplus vaccine doses to poor countries was the right thing to do, in practice, it has been slow, it's been inefficient, and in this government's case, it's been used as a cover to make further stealth cuts to our aid budget at poor countries' expense. Developing countries should not have to wait for handouts at the back of the queue, and the next Labour government would strengthen global health systems using the NHS as a model, and we will help to establish an international mechanism to rapidly produce and distribute vaccines, share technology, knowledge and skills, and build the infrastructure that the world needs to deliver it. We need a global effort to develop viable, orally active vaccines in solid dose form, building on the innovative work carried out by a number of pharmaceutical companies. That would be a historic breakthrough, including the prospect of a vaccine delivery system which doesn't rely on needles and could lead to less need for trained vaccinators, increased take-up, and negates cold chain storage, meaning fewer doses would expire before they could be used. And finally, we need a binding, enforceable investment and trade agreement among all participating countries to govern the coordination of supplies and the financing of production, to prevent hoarding of materials and equipment, and to centrally manage the production and distribution process for maximum efficiency and output in the wake of a pandemic being declared. I'm pleased to see that this draft treaty offers a really strong starting point: technology transfer. Open sharing of vaccines, science, technology and knowledge through the TRIPS waiver would help ensure everyone can access vaccines, diagnostics and therapeutics, and that no one is left behind. I'd be grateful if the Minister could set out the government's approach to negotiations, particularly on the matter of intellectual property waivers, increased local production capacity and conditions on public funding for research. In future international initiatives, we need to follow the letter. And in spirit, does the Minister recognise the importance of an accountability framework to ensure the Accord's success, and will she and her officials be pushing for this in talks? Separately, does she acknowledge the continued importance of action to address the debt crisis in low-income countries, which is clearly diverting resources away from public services and health systems, and what she sees as the UK's role in helping to unlock relief for countries in debt distress and bring creditors to the table? The task of negotiating an effective international treaty on pandemic preparedness will be an historic task. But if we can achieve it, it will save hundreds of thousands of lives in the years to come. It will provide the foundation for a sustained global economic recovery, and it will give us and our partners the freedom and confidence to plan for the future. Labour has a comprehensive plan to strengthen Britain's health security, to end the 13 years of sticking plaster politics under this government and return Britain to the international stage as a trusted development partner. Thank you.
Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Ms McDonough. Ms Honour, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Don Valley, for securing this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee, but of course, importantly, on behalf of those petitioners who signed this important petition. And I'm also grateful for the contributions of all honourable members, and will try to respond to the points raised as best I can, and ask officials to write to members to answer those questions which I'm unable to provide answers for today. In particular, the Honourable Lady for Birmingham Edgerton has taken the opportunity, entirely unsurprisingly, to ask a whole series of questions on an area which my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, would be highly capable of responding to, but of course he is unable to be here due to other ministerial duties, so I will ensure that responses are provided for those. Ms McDonough, as COVID-19 clearly demonstrated, it is in all our interests to invest in global health. And the world was ill-prepared for the pandemic, which killed millions, wiped billions off the global economy, and undid years of progress on our development goals. The 3 years since COVID struck have been a wake-up call for the whole world. And they've highlighted the importance of strong, resilient and inclusive health systems. And they've made clear that we need a coordinated approach across our work on human health, animal health and the environment. COVID also shone a spotlight on the need for agreed international protocols so that information is shared in a timely fashion. And it underlined how important it is that vaccines, treatments and tests are available to all who need them. In short, we need collective international action, cooperation and mutual accountability in order to protect future generations from the catastrophic impact of pandemics, of which the best ways to manage communities of all economic strength and resilient shapes and sizes is, of course, one critical part. This is why the UK is working with G7 partners and, of course, others to catalyse international efforts to try to help the world, for countries and our citizens, countries of all shapes and sizes, to be better prepared. So as part of this, the member for Uxbridge, the former Prime Minister, joined other world leaders in 2021 in calling for a new international instrument to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. All 194 WHO member states agreed by consensus to draft and negotiate a new pandemic instrument. There was a clear view that this could transform global health security, delivering the changes necessary to withstand those health threats. For example, making sure that the world has fit-for-purpose agreements in place for data sharing and surveillance to be able to help slow or indeed contain the spread of disease and to support a speedy and effective response. And in November 2021, together with the other members of the World Health Organization, the UK agreed to establish an intergovernmental body to draft and negotiate this new pandemic instrument with a target date of May 2024. To answer my honourable friend, the member for Christchurch, those negotiations are being negotiated with a view to adoption under Article 19 of the WHO Constitution, but this is without prejudice to considering adoption under Article 21 as these negotiations progress, if that were to be the preferred decision of all member states in the consensus decision that they hope to reach. The Article 19 route would not negate the use for each member state to accept it through their own national constitutional processes, which is, of course, a really important part of the question, and I'll refer to further. Whether agreed under Article 19 or 21, both will be legally binding as a matter of international law. Ms McDonough, as part of our wider efforts to improve global health security through strengthening international law, the UK is participating in parallel negotiations to update the international health regulations, which a number of colleagues have referred to. This is the technical public health framework, which requires countries to report and respond to potential cross-border health threats. Over the next year, UK officials will shape and negotiate a text with other World Health Organization members to ensure that it delivers on our priorities. These will include working towards faster and more equitable access to affordable vaccines, treatments and tests, strengthening collaboration on scientific research and development, including clinical trials and data sharing, improving collaboration and coordination across the human, animal and environmental health sectors to try and control those threats from zoonotic diseases, amongst other of those threats that we know are out there, and building strong health systems to support populations to access the health services that they need during and after a pandemic. And we are already demonstrating global leadership in these priority areas. Through our multilateral and bilateral investments, we are helping low and middle income countries to develop resilient systems and services. For example, we trained more than 600 health workers in Côte d'Ivoire to strengthen surveillance, reached over 53,000 people in Cameroon through outreach campaigns led by civil society partners, and substantially increased response times to reported public health events in Mali. And through our One Health approach, we are working to monitor and control the spread of diseases between humans, animals and the environment. We supported Cameroon to carry out a simulation exercise which tested and refined plans to deal with disease outbreaks of zoonotic origin, including monkeypox. Meanwhile, our investments in research and development are increasing equitable access to vaccines, drugs and diagnostics. With UK support, for instance, the Medicines for Malaria venture has developed and rolled out more than 13 new anti-malarials. And to date, these medicines have saved an estimated 2.7 million lives. In all of this, we are working in strong partnership with academic institutions, with the private sector and other organisations. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI as it's known, is a great example of this partnership work, helping to ensure that medical innovations are affordable and accessible to those in need. The FCDO has committed £230 million to CEPI to support the development of vaccines for COVID-19, which includes the COVID-19 vaccine candidate developed by the University of Oxford with AstraZeneca, with support from the Department of Health's UK vaccine network. And as we have seen, the Oxford-AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine has saved lives worldwide. The UK has been a global leader working with CEPI, Gavi and the WHO to ensure that our scientific leaders can help tackle health crises. I was proud, as the Secretary of State for International Development back in early 2020, to lead the fundraising for Gavi and COVAX to ensure that those vaccines, once we hoped they would be found, could be delivered as quickly as possible through the incredible networks that the organisations like Gavi can have to reach across the globe. But it was clear as COVID hit that stronger collective international action, cooperation and mutual accountability are going to be needed if we are to tackle more effectively global health threats of the future, which sadly, as colleagues have said, we know is something we need to be prepared for. So this is indeed... Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful. As far as China is concerned, does she believe that China is complying with the requirements to be open and transparent, share all its data, let everybody know exactly how this COVID-19 virus began? Or does she believe that China is covering it up?
My honourable friend speaks with a passion which we all know and respect, and I am not the expert with regards, but I think there is much commentary on whether there is the full clarity and transparency that we have seen from some countries. And indeed, when I talk about wanting to be able to build stronger collective cooperation and mutual accountability, that is indeed one of the reasons why we want to support the development of this new pandemic instrument. So, if I may, Mr. Donner, I'll try and tackle some of the concerns that have been raised over this proposed instrument, which have been raised and highlighted in, obviously, in the petition. First of all, I'd like to be clear that, of course, no text has yet been agreed, and the process of drafting and negotiating, it is ongoing, and we certainly don't expect the text to be agreed before May of next year. This is a member state-led process, and it's member states negotiating the treaty, not the WHO. The WHO Secretariat is supporting the process, and that's a very technical and bureaucratic system. But it's really important to understand that also colleagues have mentioned changes to the international health regulations. These are an important legal framework which is intended to prevent, protect against, control and indeed provide a public health response to the international spread of disease, which is commensurate with the public health risk involved, and indeed helps to avoid unnecessary interference with international trade and flows to try and help economies to continue to be as strong as they can under those sorts of pressures. The UK and other WHO member states adopted the current version of the IHRs in 2005, and they came into force in UK law in 2007. So negotiations on targeted amendments are looking at improving the framework in light of the COVID-19 lessons learned. And I just want to be clear that the UK is right at the heart of these negotiations, and of course we will work for good outcomes for the UK and for all those member states who we wish to work and support. Yes, of course.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and she says that the amendments are being brought forward on lessons that have been learned. But does she not agree that the WHO have refused to have an investigation into how they've handled themselves and the recommendations they've made during the pandemic? So how can we have a knowledge of where it went right and where it went wrong if they won't have a review of their own performance?
Thank you, Ms McDonough. I think we have all looked very closely at that, and the right honourable gentleman highlights the question. The whole point of these negotiations, discussions, is that all member states bring their expertise, their experiences, of course, to the party. And as I say, the UK is at the heart of those negotiations and will be looking to make sure that if a text is found that can be agreed by all member states, it's one which meets some of those challenges and those lessons learned that we have all identified in individual states, and indeed working together in many ways as we have done as an international community. And of course, importantly, Ms McDonough, that once those amendments are identified, acceptance of them would require changes to our own domestic law through legislation, as we would do in the usual way. We are, of course, and it's been discussed at some length, we are a sovereign state in control of whether we enter into international agreements. Personally, having spent many, many hours in various international negotiating fora in recent years, and I know that absolutely that the UK's voice, our expertise, our wisdom, and of course our trusted partner status with so many other member states within the UN family is respected and listened to. So I know that as discussions continue with our officials, our experts, both from health, from our various expert teams across our government, and the leadership that we bring together into those discussions will ensure that we should have confidence in the discussions. Yes, of course I will.
Can the Minister give reassurance to my constituents who are concerned that the government will concede sovereignty and hand over power to the WHO? Can she give them some reassurances that won't happen?
Yes, absolutely I can. Because this speculation that somehow this instrument would undermine UK sovereignty and give WHO powers over national public health measures is simply not the case. So I absolutely can reassure both my honourable friend, the member for Tatton, and indeed my honourable friend, the member for Hastings and Rye, who raised a similar issue earlier, and indeed on behalf of all their constituents, this is not the case. The UK remains in control of any future domestic decisions about public health matters, for instance, domestic vaccination and others which might be needed in any future pandemic that we may have to manage. Protecting those national sovereign rights is a distinct principle in the current draft text, and of course other members have also identified this as an important priority. So it's good to have the opportunity in this debate brought forward by those who have concerns about this to be able to restate that that is absolutely not at threat. But I think, to conclude, we must ensure that those future pandemics, which I fear we may have to tackle, or our children may have to tackle, do not come at the same devastating cost as COVID-19 has done. We have the opportunity now to make real and lasting improvements to the way that the international community prepares for, prevents and indeed responds to global health threats. The UK's voice, our scientific leadership and indeed the strength of our democratic processes will assure that our vision for global health planning and pandemic preparedness are at the heart of any new treaty to protect the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd first like to thank the petitioners for signing this petition. It's others, as I thank the members of the public for turning up here today. As you can be seen, it's been a well-debated topic, and I hope they're pleased with the outcome of that. I thank the Minister for her comments and for her assurances that she's just given to that. Sovereignty has been hard fought for in this country, and it's something obviously that the government will see that it's not something that we want to hand over lightly. I do genuinely believe it has been a good debate, and I hope the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response will look at the wonderful work that Hansard do in putting this out there, and realise that there's an awful lot of concern about this. We all want to protect people across the globe. It's how we do it. That's the important part. So I would just like to thank all members once again, and thank the Chair for the work today.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 614335 relating to an international agreement on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. As many of that opinion say aye, of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. This sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.